Hi, my name's Andy Young and I'm one of the automotive lecturers down at Unitech in Auckland, New Zealand. We're still on with the Yamaha Viking. This is proving to be much number of videos, which is great. I'm trying to break it down into smaller chunks, just so you don't have to watch the whole video, the one bit that you really want to watch. We're replacing the piston and rings. We've just finished honing the bore. This is the old piston, the old rings, the old pin that will come out. There you go, look. So the old piston pin as well. I'm going to replace all of that. The reason for this is this engine was used for quite a period of time where it was experiencing overheating. We diagnosed that as a failed head gasket. Now that could well have been a secondary failure because we feel, judging by what the customers told me, the thermostat had failed. It failed in the closed position. Engine had overheated. It warped the head gasket failed. So we've had the head skimmed and bits and pieces. It's all on the previous videos. So on this one, I'm going to show you how to fit a new piston and rings, a new pin to a conroe, and then we're going to move on and fit the barrel. And then the next video will be rebuilding the head and fitting the head. That's the plan. Now you may notice on most pistons they will either have, this is the old one by the way, an arrow or a dot. This one's got a dot, and that tells you that is forward on the engine towards the exhaust port on this particular motor. Very important, you don't put the piston in that way around, because if you did, then the clearance on the valves, the radius here is quite different. Remember, intake valves are usually, well, they're always larger in diameter than the exhaust valves. That's because it's more important to get the stuff in than get it out. That's not really true. Okay, theory lessons will tell you why that's the case. Right, so without further ado, let's move on. Right, piston. Out the nice, ooh, can you see that? Yeah, nice Yamaha box. Always use genuine parts. That's what I think anyway. So one shiny, nice new piston. Now we've not done a rebore, we've just done a hone, so this is still original size piston. Same as it came out of the factory. There's the bore. So before you start really, pop the piston ring into the bore and rotate it round so it sits in the bore parallel. Now you can actually use the piston to square it up in the bore. If you just push it down gently with that, it will then assure that the ring is in the bore correctly. Now, I'll get a pointy stick for you. That'll do. Right, you can see here where the two ends of the piston ring join, and there's a tiny gap, and that's called the ring gap, and that ring gap needs to be set. If the gap is too large, then something's not right with your parts. If the gap, and you'll need to go for rebore and whatever, new rings, next size up. If the gap is too small, then the ring, and you measure it using feeler gauges, you then take the ring out and you very gently file with a very fine file one end of the ring, and then keep checking it until you get the correct ring gap. And you need to do that for the top ring, which is the one that's in there now, and the second ring. Now, to show you the markings as well, there we go. Piston rings have to be fitted in the correct order. The top ring is quite different to the second ring. I mean, okay, it's a different colour, but if you look on, where is it? Can you see that? Put my hand behind it, it's going to focus. On there, on that ring, there you go, there is a little letter R. Now that R denotes it's the top ring in the manual. And on this ring, this should be a bit easy to see because it's, oh there you go, look, okay, that one's got RN on the ring, and that's the second ring. Now, not only have you got to put them on the piston in the correct order, the obviously we've got all these little gaps. You know, when they're in the bore, we've got these little tiny gaps where combustion gases are going to escape down and oil's going to escape down, all that kind of stuff. So what we do is we have to offset the positioning of these rings. And what I'll do is I'll find a marker pen and I'm going to mark on the top of the piston the positions of where each of those rings should be. Now the oil scraper ring is made up of three parts. We have the springy bit, and we have the two very, very thin piston rings which sit top and bottom of that. Now, it is difficult to show you on camera because the resolution is not the world's greatest, but you always fit this first, and I don't know if you can see or not, but on that spring it's got little shoulders right at the back, and what happens is when you fit it, that ring should sit, there you go, should sit against those shoulders. It should not sit on top of the shoulders. It's very important that when you fit the whole thing you make sure that that's the case, because if it doesn't sit on the shoulders, that spring isn't going to help push the ring out and scrape down the bore. If it doesn't scrape down the bore with sufficient pressure, oil, this is the oil scraper ring, don't forget, oil is going to leak past up into the cylinder, and it's going to get burnt with the fuel and the air, which is going to give us blue smoke, so you're going to end up with a smoking engine. These tend not to, well, obviously the spring you can't ring gap anyway, but these tend not to need to be ring gapped. It's the two main piston rings, the top and the middle, or the first and second as they call it, that need to be checked for the ring gap, and I'll be doing that very shortly. Okay, so just to show you how to do ring gap, we've got feeler gauges, and I've installed the top ring. That's the one with the letter R on there. You might be able to see that or not. Letter R is the top ring, and the spec on this particular engine for the Yamaha Viking 2013, we need to have a ring gap of 0.2 to 0.35 millimeters. So we've got 0.35, well, a fraction over, 0.35 millimeters feeler gauge. Now that should not fit through, and it doesn't, it's tight. So now if we find a feeler gauge of 0.2, oh there we go, 0.203, that's near enough, and that should fit through. So that should go in there. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so it's the gap is larger than 0.2 but smaller than 0.35. So that ring is in spec and can now be fitted to the piston. Now it's time for the second ring, and that's the one with RN. There you go, I think you can, yeah, with RN on the ring. So we can pop that in very carefully. Use the piston to square it up in the bore. There we go. Now on this one, the ring gap is larger. You can actually see it's physically larger straight away. Now on this one it should be 0.75 to 0.9 millimeters. So let's see if we've got a feeler gauge of 0.9. Oh golly, 8.89. So 0.889 is the largest I've got, which is near as damn it. So it shouldn't be larger than this. You see that okay? You can see that fine, can't you? Right. Okay, and that just to say fits in. It's actually quite snug. .9. Okay. So yeah, that fits. So it's just to say on the limit is that ring. Cool. happy with that. That's a pass. Obviously, if we go for 0.75, then it's going to fit in the gap. But it's right on the upper limit, is that ring. Don't know why we're so close there, but hey. Check that once more. Do a parallel to the bore. Oh, there we go. That's a bit tighter. Cool. Okay. Yep, very happy with that. So that is a pass. And we can fit that ring to the piston as well. We'll do that shortly. Now, oh, there is a spec for the oil rings. Okay, so we can do those as well. There are some limits, actually. The specification for the top ring is 0.2 to 0.35 millimeters, but the maximum limit is 0.6, so that we were within the spec on that one anyway. On the second ring that we've just done, the spec is 0.75 to 0.9 standard, but the limit is 1.25 mil, and you know, we were right on the edge of 0.9, or we're actually 0.89 was our ring gap. So there is some tolerance permitted. And obviously we have honed this bore, so it's going to be slightly larger than original spec, so that's probably why we're a bit higher on that one. Now, the oil rings, they do have an end gap spec, so we may as well do those while we're on. They're a bit fiddly, so be careful with them. And you can tell these things have got hardly any pressure against the cylinder wall, because they just don't want to stay where they're put. So, gently do that, give it a little shove down. Now, this one, the spec is 0.2 to 0.7 millimeters. So if we find a 0.7, 0.71, that's sort of near enough. So that should not go through the gap. If it does, then we're out of spec. No. Too tight. Okay, it looks bigger than 0.2, but we'll just double check it. There we go. So there's a 0.2. Yep, perfect. So that one's a pass, we can fit that. And finally, the other oil ring, because there's two of them. Pop that in there. Use our piston to line it up. Okay, so 0.2 again. This should fit in. Yeah, it does. And 0.7. There we go, 0.71. This most definitely should not fit in. Nah, no way. Okay. So again, that's a pass. Great job. Okay, so I've marked up on the piston the positions that the ring gaps need to be in. Now, please forgive my writing. I am only a mechanic. We've got here the dot mark on the piston. That needs to point towards the exhaust port on the cylinder head. So in all intents and purposes, that's, on this particular engine, rearward in the vehicle, because the engine's the other way around. So that's the exhaust port. Now, starting up here, we've got the position where the upper oil ring, the upper oil scraper ring, the ring gap needs to be at this position. And if that was 6 o'clock, this is about 1 o'clock. The top ring should be here, which is about 3 o'clock. And then down here, the spring, this one here, the gap on the spring should be down here about 5 o'clock. And then the lower oil scraper ring should be around about 7 o'clock. And the second ring, its gap should be about 9 o'clock. And it is critical that it's set up in this way to minimize any kind of leakage of gas. We need to keep maximum compression. These rings shouldn't migrate. Sometimes they wander about a bit over time, but once they've bedded in, they tend to stay in their set positions. So there you go. I hope that makes sense to you. I can't show you the diagram in the Yamaha manual because that's copyright, but I can show you this. Okay, so we've already fitted the spring for the oil scraper ring, and that should have the ring gap here. So we just rotate it round, and it is fiddly. You've got to keep realigning stuff because it keeps moving. So ring gap, which is just there, look. Not easy to see. There we go. Round to there. Perfect. Now, we now need to fit one of the oil rings. So, now the lower oil ring should be over here, so we'll put it somewhere like. Put that in there. So when I was a kid, I hope that's not right. When I was younger, the first engine that I rebuilt was a Honda C50. And the Honda C50 had really brittle piston rings. Oh, and so did a Suzuki Beamish that I had. Okay. So the join, yeah, there we are. So the join for the spring is here, which is nearest damn it, and the join for the lower ring is here, which lines up. So we've just got the top rings put on now. Yeah, I had a Suzuki Beamish 2-stroke, single cylinder 250cc, and that was crazy brittle on the spring, on the rings, and yes, I did break them, but I was only 12, maybe 13, so I think you can forgive me. Right. There we go. So there you go. That's how to install the oil scraper ring. And we've got the positions, the ring gaps in the correct position. There we go. As per what Mr. Yamaha wants. Now, the next one to go on is the second ring, and the second ring is the one with RN labelled on. We've got that on there, look. You see that, RN? And obviously the lettering has to go to the top. Now the second ring gap needs to be here, so we will just drop that. Now these are a lot more brittle, so you've got to work your way in with these. Just got to work round, getting it into that groove. So it's gone in, you put it into the top one first and then run it down to the second. There you go. Okay, so you've got the lettering at the top. There you go, lettering at the top, and the ring gap. We'll line those up again later on because they do move around a bit. And then finally, the top ring. And the top ring has got an R on there. And the top ring wants to be over here somewhere, so we'll bang it in there like that. So yeah, rings, maybe I've got better at fitting them, I don't know, but rings tend to be not quite as brittle as they used to be. Maybe it's slightly better material. There we go. So you can see when the rings are on, they are massively larger than the piston. And what we have to do now is compress those rings down when we fit the barrel. And we'll be doing that a bit later on. So there you go, with it all labelled up on top of the piston, and that'll burn off as soon as we start the engine. Labelled at the top of the piston, we can keep easily checking that everything's lining up before we drop the barrel on. So there you go, how to fit new piston rings to your piston. And the alignment is critical, and you're going to get this out of the workshop manual, this information. Don't, whatever you do, line them all up straight. That will be terrible. If you don't know, then just stagger them. It's better than nothing. But if you've got access to the information, you can drop on the net and download a workshop manual. It will tell you in the manual exactly where they all should be. If it's a 2-stroke piston, then it won't have an oil scraper ring, obviously. it'll just have the 2 rings, and they will be pinned. So there's a little brass pin normally in the piston, and the ring gap has to have the pin between it, and that prevents the rings from turning, so that then they don't catch on any of the exhaust ports. Okay, so now we can install the piston onto the conrod. Okay, now the piston pin, and we have a nice shiny new one. Well, not so shiny actually, dull. Piston pin fits inside there like that. Now, to prevent it moving around and smacking into the cylinder wall, at each end there is a circlip groove, and we have to fit one of these. Now, you don't want the gap where this is, because that little notch there is to help you later on when you strip it down to get a little screwdriver or a stick under there, pointy stick, to lever that circlip out. So the actual gap should be ideally somewhere up there like that. Okay, again in the manual it'll tell you exactly where it should be, but near enough. As long as it's well away from that hole, that little notch, we're all good. Fitting these things, and you can only fit one obviously with the piston loose. The second one has to go in once you put the pin through, which means the piston's on the conrod. These things are a real pain to fit. You've got to be very careful with them. If you over compress, then they're going to lose their springiness. It doesn't matter if you scratch the piston down here, it's completely irrelevant. So now we can just work our way around. And what I'm doing is I'm holding, holding the end of that ring in the groove so it can't slip down. Yeah, I think everybody in the world struggles with these things. If you've got a trick, then please put it in the comments, because there you go, they're not easy. So you can see that the spring, the circlip, is a long way away from this bit, and you can see now that when we come to, well, whoever does in the future, if it ever needs to be the piston taken off, then you can get your little screwdriver in there and you can lever that. I won't do it because it will lose some of the tension, but you can lever that out to remove it. Very easy. Okay, we can now finally fit the piston to the conrod. Okay, so we have the new piston pin, and we're just going to smear that in oil. It's very important when doing an engine rebuild that everything is lubricated, because when you first start this engine up, by having so many dry surfaces, it's going to cause tremendous amounts of wear. Shouldn't be in there, which of course you don't want. So, piston over the conrod, very simply slide that through, all the way through, and that will, obviously with the dot to the rear. Now to the exhaust valve. Right. Yep, right against that circlip on this side. That's great. Okay, now for the fun. And before we start the fun, we need, because these spring clips can fly all over the workshop, and if you don't want to do a complete engine rebuild, you need to make sure that you completely block off the crankcase. Really important, because these little clips can very, very easily fall in there. So make sure that the conrod is fully, basically the crankshaft is in TDC position, so you've got maximum space to work. You'll find that these rags are great because they also help to hold everything a little bit for you as well while you're working on it. There we go. We've also got another big hole here, so I'm going to put another rag in there. There we go. Okay. So now we should be ready to fit that final circlip. Sorry about the really crappy camera angle, it's about as good as I can get for you. Exactly the same principle as before. Now, I know you're not going to see a lot with this, but you've seen me do it on the previous one. just put the spring clip in and then hold the top edge in the groove with your finger. They're not easy. They're never easy. I hate them. This is probably my Achilles heel, or one of them. Oh, nearly. Okay. She's in. That was easy. Wow. First time to camera. Now, again, I've made the join of that circlip pretty much opposite this access point, which is where you put your screwdriver to lever out the old one when you have to strip it down again. So that's now in, and it's lubricated. And what we can do, and we've got the piston right around, we've got the little dot towards the exhaust valve, and the exhaust valve is here. Okay, we can now drop on the new gasket, and we can fit the barrel. Right, so we can now remove all the rags. We've finished doing the rag stuff. And you'll see now that I've cleaned up all where the base gasket sits on the crankcases, and I've made sure that the dowels are in the crankcase. They're not in the bottom of the head, and we're going to use those dowels to help hold the gasket in position. Right, so Yamaha do a complete gasket set for these, which is fantastic, rather than ordering all the bits separately. Okay, now it's really important that you make sure that the gasket's put the correct way on, and if we look at this one here, we've got a thin side and a thick side, so it can only go on in that orientation with the tab out the back. Okay, easy enough. There you go. Okay. On. Done. Now the next step is to drop the barrel down. Obviously we've got to feed through the cam chain. We're going to need to put some oil down the bore, and we're going to need to put some oil on the piston, and we also need to double check those rings are in the right position as well. Now on the bottom of the bore, to help you, is a chamfer, and that chamfer helps you to lead the rings in. Okay, you can see that hatching in there, it's really good now. So it's all been honed, it's all ready to go, nice and dull. So we'll put a bit of oil down there, just to lubricate the bore. Now yes, the engine will smoke a little bit when you first start it up, but that smoking should stop. Should stop pretty quick. There we go, far more professional. Right. Now, because this engine has had a hone, and it's getting new pistons and rings, we're going to be using a mineral-based engine oil, because that's going to allow or help the piston rings to bed in. You don't want to be using the original quoted specified oil. When you buy a new motorcycle or a new quad bike or whatever, the initial oil that's put in the factory is usually a mineral-based oil, for that very reason, to help everything to bed in. And that's why your first service is so important, because that's when they take out the mineral-based oil and they put in the semi-synthetic or the fully synthetic oil that the engine really needs for performance and for proper lubrication purposes. But whilst the engine's bedding in, we don't need maximum protection or maximum friction reduction. So let's just check our piston ring position again. Yep, you can see it on there. So the top ring should be, yep, there we go, about there. And the second ring gap should be, oh, let's just move a little bit. Should be there. And the spring should be without moving the other ones. There's the spring. It's so hard to see some of these. Where is my pointy stick? Oh, that'll do. Okay, so we can move that around using the screwdriver. There is the spring gap done. Okay, the lower oil should be here, so we're just going to move that a fraction. Without moving this. There we go. And the top ring for the oil should be over here, which is not far off actually. So just clamping those ones. Perfect. Okay. So we've now aligned all the ring gaps. Fantastic. So now we can drop that through there and hopefully feed in those piston rings. We can use those piston ring compressors. Right, that's the first ring in. There we go. Right, time for the second ring. Oh, glove. Gloves are not ideal for this bit. You don't want to get a bit of glove stuck in there. You just gently rotate the bore. There we go, that's second ring. So all that's left now is the oil scraper ring. And you just got to take your time doing this. You really can't force any of it. There we go. Right, all rings are in the bore. It's very useful to have an assistant at this point in time. So I'm just going to fish the cam chain through. And then we can take that down. There we go. Cool. Lining up the dowels. Excellent. So, piston is now fitted and the barrel, the bore, is now in position, and all the piston rings have been checked for end gap and they've all been positioned correctly as regards angular position around the piston. So we're going to have maximum compression as well and hopefully no oil burning. Right, now we've got the cylinder in position, and what we now need to do is obviously fit the bolts, the cylinder bolts. Now this particular engine has a configuration where the cylinder, the bore bolts, are separate to the head bolts, so we can bolt this up now and we can torque it down to the correct torqueness setting, correct torque. Now I just want to snip off that zip tie. Now ideally I don't want the zip tie to drop down the barrel. That would be a pain. There we go. Right. Now we've got the second cam chain guide to fit, and it's got little lugs that sit at the top, and that just drops down, and there should be a little recess down the bottom where you can feel it drop in. It's just down there. There we go. So that's correctly positioned down there now. Cool. Do we have another zip tie? We do. If you don't do this, then you end up fishing the cam chain out the bottom of the crankcase, which isn't ideal. Right. The bolts are all the same length, so they can go in any of the holes. One thing to be sure is that the threads that these go into down the bottom are clear of oil, because what can happen is when you're doing them up, they can hydraulic on that oil, and they're not actually really tight. They're not actually clamping the cylinder down at all by any means as much pressure as it should be, which will cause the base gasket to leak. So I've cleaned all of those out. There's nothing in the threads. We're just going to do these up sort of finger tight, so to speak, and then we'll torque them down. Always doing opposites. Whenever you've got a machined surface, it's got to go down evenly. So just like when you're doing your wheel nuts up on your car, you should do opposites. Right, the specifications for these particular bolts, we've first got to tighten them to 15 Newton meters. That is not much. So you should know what a torque wrench looks like. You have to use one. That's what it's all about. Right, 15. Okay, and we can move on to the larger torque wrench, and now we need to tighten them to 50 Newton meters. Okay, normally you get a spec, a range, 45 to 55 Newton meters, but Yamaha's given us exactly 50 Newton meters, so there you go. Right, so 50 Newton meters coming up. I'm going to just work them all up progressively. Sorry, camera. Just get rid of that extension there. Okay, 50. Done. Now always remember to back off your torque wrench as soon as you finish using it, because if you don't, it can weaken the spring inside, so your torque wrench goes way out of spec. You should always get your torque wrench calibrated as well on a regular basis. So around this side we've got two small bolts which just go on the other side of the cam chain housing to make sure that this gasket here is going to be sealed properly as well. Okay, so the two smaller M6 cap head cylinder bolts to go in. and the tightening torque for those is 10 Newton meters, which is pretty standard on an M6 bolt. So all these casing bolts will be 10 Newton meters normally. But always check the manual, that's what it's about. Right, there we go, we'll use that one for there. Newton meters is not a lot. Whew, right, okay, so the piston has been fitted. We've done, we did ring gap. Ring gaps are all within spec, new rings, we've honed the bore. They will fit to the piston fitted to the conrod, and then we lowered the barrel down, we aligned all the piston rings to the correct angular position of the piston, as per the markings on there, and then we lowered the barrel down onto the piston, feeding each ring, compressing each ring into its groove, and using the chamfer at the base of the cylinder to feed the rings up and compress them into position in the bore. The next step of this build is the next video. This is the end of this one. We've done this bit. Will be to reassemble the cylinder head. We've got to refit the valves, the camshaft, rockers, heaps of stuff to do. And then once the head is ready to be fitted, then we will fit that to the engine, and we'll set the timing on the cam chain as well, the valve timing. Okay, my name is Andy Young. I'm one of the automotive lecturers down at Unitech in Auckland, New Zealand, and I find that these videos are invaluable really to help my students through the year course that we offer them, the CAT course we call it, for them to see the lecturer doing the work, doing the real world stuff, really helps to instill confidence into them that I actually know what I'm doing. Hopefully I do. I'm sure there are alternative ways sometimes of doing the things that I show you how to do. Sure, I'm not saying they're right, they're wrong, we all do our own thing. I do things the way that work for me, and I tend to stick to the workshop manuals as much as possible because they tend to be correct most of the time. Not always. There are mistakes now and again. So I hope you found this video helpful. This cylinder rebuild, replacement piston and so on is applicable really, apart from the specifications, to pretty much most single cylinder 4-stroke engines out there, especially motorcycle and quad bike engines. The honing is common to pretty much any engine really, as long as you can actually hone the barrel. Sometimes you can't, you've got to replace the whole barrel if they're coated and so on. So there you go. Finished. Next video to start. Thanks for watching. Cheers.